Mexico City. We are all very happy to be here, and I can say that those who come from far away probably enjoyed being here and enjoyed the hospitality of the people and saw the first steps in the conference organization. So this is an event of IZA. IZA is a worldwide operating think tank in labor economics, placed in Bonn, Germany, but operating with about 1,100 fellows and affiliates worldwide, and collaborate together with strong partners like the World Bank. Our seventh research division is on employment and development, and that conference here, the series, is affiliated narrowly with the existence of that program. The idea, if you go just one half sentence back to history, the idea is that we would like to contribute to poverty reduction through job creation. That's a simple theme, but I think very powerful, and it's related to formal and informal sectors, which makes it very complex. I'm very happy that the man who had the vision for the program and for this joint activity is today here and is acting. Robert Holzmann, he's sitting over there. Robert, thank you very much for making this all happening by providing the vision for such an idea and program. Now the focus 2011 is specifically social insurance and the labor markets, an issue we all know is very relevant to Latin America. The challenge is how to deal with people in the informal sector and how to finance their coverage. Now we managed this time to put together a series of meetings. It's actually 4 events which take place here. First, the Sexta Conference on Monday and Tuesday. There is a policy day on Wednesday. Parallel to that is a child labor workshop of IZA's child labor group. And already last night, so to speak, yesterday, there was a workshop organized by IDRC on developing issues. Many people have made this series of conferences here in Mexico City happen. The program committee, in particular, Robert Holzmann as the chair, and also the program directors of IZA, David Oberlino from the World Bank and Markus Fröhlich from Mannheim University. A large organizational committee with people from various organizations. That's a very complex program. Martin Clemens, Joyce Sapka, Friederike Rother, Stefan Kurzer, Mark Falak, just to mention a few for everybody. They really did a great job already before the conference started. Such a thing is only possible to do if you have a few strong organizations collaborating. On the top is, of course, the World Bank. Without their umbrella, this would not be possible, and I'm grateful to Mahmoud Muhyiddin, who is here, for the support, to Arab Banerjee, who couldn't make it this time, to Michael Rutkowski, who would soon speak. But I also have to thank the main sponsor of the meetings, Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, David Kaplan, in particular, who has worked with us heavily, and Santiago Levy, who will talk soon to us, who was very supportive. And we have, of course, ITAM. These are here the premises, and I have to thank the Vice Rector, President Alejandro Hernandez, who will soon introduce Santiago Levy. Also, IDRC, some of you have already seen the people, the International Development Research Center of Canada, with Edgar Rodriguez, has helped us bringing people over. I know that most of us, or many of us know that Mexico is in the middle of a reform debate on the labor markets and social security. We wish the country the good luck and all the strength you need. I can only say from Germany that it pays to work hard for a few years and to go ahead and do the reforms. And then we'll see what's going on maybe a few years later. Now we have the Minister of Labor and Welfare on Wednesday, and we will be able to talk about these issues there. Well, the major event, of course, today is the visit of the President tonight. Felipe Calderón, the President of Mexico, has accepted the invitation to talk to us tonight. This is a great honor, really great honor to us. I cannot say much now to this issue. You will understand we have no time at the moment, but I was strongly encouraged by my administrative team to already mention now, and we will repeat that during the day a few times, the following issues. To make this a success tonight, we need a bus transfer. We have to move away from this and here. And we have to be in time, and we have to go through security measures that all people will understand. So session C, if you're a chair of the session C or presenter, you have to end in time, really on the time, on the session. We leave 5 to 10 minutes after the sessions with the bus, and there's no warning, we are leaving. I know you will have luggage with you or laptops or whatever, you can have that, but you have to leave with that bus, and you have to leave that on the spot there in a separate room, and there will be somebody supervising the stuff. So we cannot go with any kind of material to the main room. So there we all have to sit. So there's a special seating for the first 3 rows, but all other rows are free. But it's very important to understand that nobody can stand up when the President is in the room. So just go in, sit there, and that's just part of the many security issues we have to face, and which are, I think, useful to understand. Now, as some of you have may see already yesterday, also in the conference material, I am happy to say that we published a little article in El Universal yesterday on a comparison between integration between Germany, Poland at the one side, and Mexico and the United States. On the other side, the lesson is there is much to learn between this kind of transatlantic comparison. The key issue is that the more open the borders, that's my point, the smaller is migration, and the more beneficial, the more open the borders, the smaller is migration, and the more beneficial is the economic exchange we have. Well, as President Felipe Calderón recently, rightfully, pointed out, the only way in which we can find prosperity for the American and Mexican economies is working together through integration. And I think that's a very useful theme also for us, for this conference. Working together through integration, I think is a nice slogan for this conference. That is what it is about. We need to collaborate and to work together. We need to integrate, to make this world better, and I think that's what we want to achieve, and I'm happy to say that I very much appreciate to be here, and I now announce Michael Rutkowski to address us in the name of our co-organizer, the World Bank.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to this conference on behalf of the World Bank. I have to say it's enormous fun to be here. It's different than many other things we do in the bank. Being in a conference in which focus on development meets policy-relevant research is so important and so rare, in fact, because too often thinking about development and research on development do not go together. So I'm extremely happy always to be at IZA conference, IZA World Bank conference. I'm so happy that we have partners such as IDB and ITAM here together, and this is going to be a great event, I'm sure. I wanted to share with you my thoughts on 3 trends which I've observed lately, last 20 years, regarding labor market and focus on the labor market and the World Bank, where I'm from. The first is the labor markets and the World Bank. You know, in 1992 there was a moment that the World Bank employed just 1 labor economist. There was total no interest in not only research but in development-oriented reflection on labor markets, as labor market was seen essentially as a derived market after the product market. So whatever happens on the product market, then they have the derived demand, and why would you look there? So how much change now? It's amazing. It is one of the biggest focuses of what the bank does. You'd be perhaps pleased to hear that in the World Bank we are planning increasingly to focus on labor markets, including worldwide work, including regional work. In my region where I work now, the main flagship report we are working is more and better jobs for South Asia. I'm now responsible for the South Asia region of the bank. And so many things which we do through labor market lenses, having in mind the wage income as being the main determinant of income, poverty, and inequality. And in this journey, we've been very much with other partners, reliable partners such as IZA, such as IDB, and now ITAM too. The second trend I'd like to share with you is movement of research from developed to developing countries. And I remember a number, like about 7-8 years ago, that 85% of labor market research focuses on data from developed countries. It has changed significantly, and many of you here are to be credited for that, because you do focus on policy relevant work based on data sets from developing countries, trying to focus on them. And that trend is extremely important. Policy relevant research going south, I would label it that way. And this going south means really going to where the rubber hits the road, where the needs are the biggest, where the topics are the most under-researched. And this is what is happening, and I see this trend very clearly in this conference. Finally, last but not least, the third trend, very much related to the previous one, is movement towards looking really very hard at informal labor markets, not only at formal labor markets, which is very different than what fascinated and excited labor economists 20 years ago. There were always some Gary Phillipses here who worked at developing countries and informal labor markets, but I remember such passionate debates about things like Calfor's Driffield curve, or whether bargaining with unions happens at the industry level, firm level, or central level, and what wage outcomes are produced. All very important for more or less 4 or 5% of workers in the world. That would be my line on that. That was the problem, not that it wasn't unimportant, but it was of major importance for a subset of labor markets that happened to occur in the highest developed countries in the world. But it is not the case in developing countries. I already mentioned I work on South Asia. In South Asia, 91% of workers operate in an unorganized sector, what we would call informal labor market. Only 9%, depending how you count, it could vary from 7 to 11. But only that number has a wage contract. So I so much welcome, and many of us so much welcome, that so many of you refocused and started really looking at what's happening in the unorganized sector, in the informal labor markets. And I very much welcome the fact that this year, the main topic of the conference actually links that informal labor market focus with social security for those who are in an organized sector. The linkage between the two, providing those who are not covered by formal arrangements with some risk management tools so that they can do something about their income and life, is absolutely central for development, and I do have a strong sense that for many years we have not had sufficient focus on that. So I really would like genuinely and wholeheartedly to congratulate the organizers, IZA, IDB, ITAM, and my friends and colleagues from the World Bank for really focusing our attention on something that is so important and that is so much, and which importance for so many years escaped the attention researchers, but also policymakers. When I am in India, I see a lot of formal sector bias in terms of policy orientation and very little relatively thought about what's happening in the informal market. And here I'm very happy that Santiago will be one of the presenters this morning. His phrase from the Human Development Forum from the World Bank, when he talked about informal labor market, and he said, well, if you provide security for the informal labor market, for the informal workers, a bit as if you were subsidizing informality. And that phrase is stuck in my mind, and I think may provide a leitmotif for many discussions today and tomorrow and during the policy day on Wednesday, and I look forward to that. It's always good to be in a good company and discussing a topic of high relevance. So thank you very much and welcome again. I must say I am also very grateful for the pooling power of IZA. President Calderón is coming. I'm so happy he comes here because of IZA, and we'll learn what the World Bank, IDB, and ITAM are while here. So after all those steps which Klaus walked us through, let's follow them. I'm going to be there as the procedure seems to be exactly the same for all presidents of the world here. I remember meeting on Manmohan Singh on the nutrition conference, and the security measures were exactly the ones as you described, Klaus, for President Calderón. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Welcome, and I look forward to having a very good conference.
Okay. Good morning. We're going to get started with our first plenary session. My name is Arturo Fernández, and I'm a provost here at ITAM. If I may, before introducing our lecturer this morning, just say a few words. Welcoming you all to ITAM, to Mexico City. It's a privilege for us to have to host this conference. I'm very grateful to IZA, to the World Bank, to the IDB for trusting ITAM in the organization of this event. I should say I also congratulate them for choosing Joyce as our local organizer. We're going to have a smooth conference, I assure you. She's been working very hard, so thank you, Joyce. Of course, for us here at ITAM, one can hardly think of a more relevant conference than talking about employment and development. If I may just add one personal reflection, it's easy, I think, to trivialize development by just focusing too much or concentrating in one issue as this is the cornerstone of development. Of course, it's a complicated thing. It has to do with education. It has to do with health, with migration, with lots of things, financial markets, etc. But when you think what's happening in middle-sized or middle-income countries like my own Mexico, clearly you have to look towards the dysfunctionality of labor markets, and that has to be the main culprit of the sluggishness of development or the lack of a faster development. We have a bad formal sector, overly regulated, and we have this disastrous informal sector, which I believe is highly unproductive and, in my opinion, the main obstacle for development. So I think that the issues that are going to be discussed in this conference, and particularly in this session, are precisely on the spot. So I'm really happy to be here, and just say I will finish again thanking you all, and if there's anything you need over the course of these 3 days, please do not hesitate to contact any of us, our volunteers in green shirts, to help you with whatever you need. Thank you so much. Okay, that said, let me move now to introduce our speaker this morning. I'm very happy to do so. Santiago and I go back to, we're saying, about 3 decades or so. So not only am I happy here to introduce a good friend, but also I believe is one of the leading development economists of our times. Many of you do not know, but Santiago started both his education and his scholarly career here at ITAM. So he considers himself to be a member of our community, and certainly we always see him as one of the most prominent and the brightest member of our academic community. Santiago has been a long academic career at Boston University, and then moved to Mexico, where he has had several very important positions where he has done a lot. He was actually the first, I believe, president of the Competition Commission here in Mexico. So he's among other things, responsible for setting that up, and the Antitrust Commission in Mexico. He was also Undersecretary of Finance, where he, among other things, was the architect of the Progress Oportunidades program. Later moved as General Director of the Institute of Social Security in Mexico. Santiago is back, fortunately for many of us, because he's still feeding us with provocative and important ideas. He's back writing books, writing papers, of course now as Vice President for Sector and Knowledge at the IDB. So without further ado, Santiago, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Well, good morning, everybody, and let me begin by thanking Alejandro for those very, very kind words. It is truly a great pleasure to be here this morning, partly for the reasons that Alejandro mentioned, of being back in my alma mater, but also because 2 years ago I had the privilege of being also the keynote speaker at the IZA World Bank Conference in Rome, and I told Robert, I said, you know, we should do this in Latin America. We should do a conference like this in Latin America, and we should pull together, and the IDB would be really happy to work together with the World Bank and with IZA. So thank you, Robert. I want to thank David Laurino, who's also been instrumental for that. Of course, Mr. Zimmerman at IZA. Alejandro for your hospitality. It's lovely to be here back again. And David Kaplan from IDB, who's really done a lot of work from our side. So what I want to share with you this morning is joint work with Arturo and Felipe Calderón. They're both at CIDE and I'm at IDB. This is not, of course, the opinion of any of the people there. And the title intends to be provocative, and I'll end with a provocation again, by trying to call attention to the fact that it is possible, I believe, and this is the central point of my presentation this morning, it is possible in a precise sense to end informality. And I think Mexico is within a stone's throw of doing it. And I will argue that the central problem is a conceptual problem and it is not a fiscal problem to actually be able to do so. So that's the... So I want to give a little bit of motivation, then speak a little bit of precise definition of formality and informality, 3 stylized facts that are relevant for the story that I want to tell, then tell you a little bit about the structure of the model that we're using to pull this together, model calibration, 3 preliminary questions, and then the main piece of the analysis, which is the proposal to go to universal social insurance, and that apply for informality, and then some concluding remarks. And I guess I will have to stand here. So, Mexico is really no different from many other countries in Latin America. We have Bismarckian Social Security, which is social insurance paid with wage-based contributions. This is mostly limited to workers in the formal sector, and I will call these contributory social insurance, CSI. Throughout Latin America, and in Mexico, we'll give some more details in a minute, there's a growing importance of various large numbers of social insurance programs for informal workers. These social insurance programs for informal workers are paid from general revenues, and I will call these set of programs non-contributory social insurance. And mutatis mutandis, with various details that is an evolving situation, this situation of the truncated labor state, welfare state, is characterized in Latin America. So in Bonn 2 years ago, and that was the keynote speak I gave 2 years ago, I basically argued that the way contributory social insurance works, including in the definition of social insurance, labor regulations to protect workers against firing and all that, really in the end acts like a tax on salaried labor. And that this tax on salaried labor strongly distorts the labor market and has very negative implications for the coverage of Social Security and for productivity. And then I wrote a book 2 years ago, which was one lecture, which was Good Intentions But Outcomes, which I basically said, non-contributory social insurance, the idea of providing informal workers with social insurance programs paid from general revenues, actually aggravates the allocative distortions created by contributory social insurance, because you add a subsidy to informal labor to a tax on formal labor, and erodes the tax base in a way that I'll make precise. And I'm arguing that the informality and evasion that we see in markets in Mexico are endogenous to the incentive structure generated by the interaction of contributory and non-contributory. And finally, the point that I'm arguing is that this dilemma, this architecture of having contributory social insurance and non-contributory social insurance puts the government in a very difficult dilemma. Because the dilemma for the government is there's a large set of workers out there that don't have social insurance, they're informal. The notion of not protecting them is really antithetical. But if you do so with instruments at your disposal, you're aggravating the allocative distortions that you're creating, and you're actually eroding further the tax base. So what I want to do is explore, in this work together with Arturo and Fausto, a proposal that I made to move to a fiscal reform that would sustain universal social insurance, and I want to argue that universal social insurance dominates the actual architecture of contributory and non-contributory social insurance on both social grounds, fiscal grounds, and productivity grounds. So, next. Ravi Kambur has a great quote, which is the one at the top of the slide, which I always use, because it's really very, he captures precisely the fact that we all use the word informality to mean something else. And Gary has spoken amply about this, and I think he's right. Perhaps it's time to drop the word, but it's so much in the literature out there that everybody uses it. The point here is that you have to be precise what you mean by informality, and I'm going to follow Ravi in this particular presentation, and I'm going to define formality with the compliance with a particular regulation. And that regulation is going to be the coverage of Social Security. So formality and informality resolve for the interaction of firms and workers, of who should and should not be covered, and what do workers do and what do firms do. And I will define formal workers, is the definition. Formal workers are those that are covered by Social Security, which in Mexico means the coverage of the Institute of Social Security, IMSS, the Infonavit, the Housing Institute, the Afores, the Retirement Pension System. And all other workers are informal workers. And in this presentation I will ignore public sector workers. Next please. So very importantly, I'm not defining informality by the size of firms. There are very many small firms in Mexico that I will show you in a minute that are formal. Informality is not equivalent to illegality. Self-employed workers are not required by law to enroll in Social Security, so informality and illegality is not the same. It's not equivalent to non-salary because the law is broken and some salaried workers are hired without Social Security, and it's not equivalent to poor workers. It's not an issue of income levels, it's an issue mostly of labor status. Next please. So with that, let me set the stage for Mexico. I begin first, next, with something very important. Mexico is characterized by very high tax evasion. The ratio of taxes to GDP is among the lowest in all the countries in Latin America, probably among the lowest of countries of middle income, countries like Mexico. Our total tax rate was slightly less than 10% to GDP in 2008. And in particular, the value-added tax is characterized, and my friends in Mexico here know this well, has a differentiated structure in which foods, medicines, and all sorts of goods that are thought to be essential have a 0 rate, and then all other goods pay, back in 2008, which is the data for this paper, a 15% rate, now a 16% rate. But the differentiated rate is very important. And the important point is there's a very large evasion of the value-added tax. People who know this much better, and Arturo Fernández has another paper with Arturo, in which they use national accounts and they simply say, given the structure of the rates, if there was no evasion, what would be the tax take? And the tax take would be about 6.1% of GDP, but we actually collected 3.7% of GDP, so the difference between the 3.7 and the 6.1 is the amount of tax evasion of the VAT that is going on. So stylized fact number 1, the VAT is evaded highly in Mexico. Next. Stylized fact number 2, there's a huge amount of informality of firms, and the pies here are actually very informative. The one on the right, on the left from your point of view, the one on the left is the census data from the 2008 census that captures 3.7 million establishments. Now, without being nerdish about this, the definition of establishment is important. Establishment, for the purpose of the census, is something that has a ceiling, has walls, and the machinery in which people work is fixed to the floor. All economic activity that takes place in the street is not captured by the census. So this is the economic activity captured by the economic census, and they registered 3.7 million establishments, of which in red, 3.3 million had between 0 and 5 workers, about 220,000 had between 6 and 10 workers, 11 to 50, 147,000, and only 37,400 establishments of 50 workers or more. That's the census data. I paired the census data with the IMSS data. The IMSS registers all the establishments that are actually registered with Social Security, whose workers are registered with Social Security. The IMSS captures 800,000 establishments. But there are 3.7 million establishments. And the size of the balls actually is done on pro rata, and as you can see, most of the large establishments are actually captured in the census, are captured in the, and for the medium size, for the 11 to 50, más o menos, it's almost there. For the green, you can see there's quite a bit of cheating, and for the red, there's a huge amount of cheating. So stylized fact number 2, 90% of all firms, this is really important for the analysis as follows, 90% of all firms have less than 5 workers. Only 1% of all firms have 50 workers or more. And there's a huge amount of evasion of firms' registration with ease. And this is proportional to size. Next, please. The third stylized fact is informality of employment. And sadly, for some reason, the PowerPoint is not working well, but the blue here, the pie is the labor force. The labor force where 43.8 million people, that's the total labor force in 2008. The gray down here are public sector workers. I'm not going to talk about these guys. The blue are the workers captured in the census. Sadly, it is covered by this, it's overlapping, it's not showing nicely, but you can see 1 to 5 up top is the majority of workers in the census, 6 to 10, 11 to 50, 50 or more. And then I had it with shades in which you could see that some were formal and some were informal, and formality increased with firm size. No news here. But the point is that workers captured in the census in firms are only the blue part of the labor force. The green is the rural labor force, and the red, this is amazing, is the urban labor force that is not captured by the census. Okay? These are the tianguis. These are the people who wash our windshields when we walk through the streets, and it's a very large chunk of the labor force. So the third stylized fact that I have here is very high informal employment, very skewed size distribution of firms, lots of evasion proportional to firm size. Next, please. These stylized facts are probably not very different in other countries of Latin America, except for the stylized facts on the VAT, in which the structure of the VAT is very peculiar to Mexico. I'm going to exploit the structure of the VAT. But the general thrust of a good chunk of the labor force working in the streets, and the size is significant, you saw by the size of the pies. Very many small establishments, and lots of evasion of both value-added taxes and lots of evasion of social security contributions, with formality increasing with firm size, is a stylized fact that characterizes a lot of Latin America. So what we want to do now is we want to capture a model to ask questions about how do firms and workers interact here, and we want to pick up the evasion of the value-added tax, we want to pick up the evasion of the social security contribution, and we want to pick up the size distribution of firms, and what does that imply for revenues and productivity. Next, please. So, we're going to work with a structure in which there are 4 goods in this model. There's an intermediate good 1 that's produced with capital and labor, an intermediate good 2 that's produced with capital and labor. Those two intermediate goods produce a good which is a final good. So I have the intermediate because I need the value-added structure to pick that up. These goods here are all the establishments captured in the blue part of my prior graph. These are firms that I know the capital stock, I can measure. And then I'm going to have a self-employment sector. The self-employment sector was the green and red of my prior graph. All the workers that are not in an establishment, either registered or not registered with IMSS, or not in an establishment. And then the capital stock is going to be distributed between the firm with the smallest capital stock, K underlined, and the firm with the highest capital stock, so the distribution of the capital stock across firms, in both the sectors that produce intermediate good 1 and intermediate good 2. Firms in these sectors are hiring salaried workers, and depending on whether firms comply, they're legal, they're formal workers. If the firms hire the workers without complying with Social Security, they're illegal, they're informal. The same in the sector 2, they're formal, they're informal. But note that the informal workers in the self-employment sector, they're all legal because the law does not require to enroll them in Social Security. So the model structure again has intermediate goods producing a final good, a self-employment, and the two, this good and that good, together make up together GDP. This good is the food and medicines sector of the economy that has a VAT of 0. This good is the other good of the economy that has a VAT of 15%. So what's the structure of taxes and subsidies in this economy? All firms in the blue part of the economy pay income taxes at the rate tau IT. The self-employment sector, I'm going to load the dice against my argument. Okay? I'm going to actually load the dice in such a way that the self-employment sector cannot be reached by the tax authorities. That's the one that pays 0 taxes, the value-added tax, so that the aggregate VAT rate of the economy is the weighted average of the VAT rates in the two sectors. And then, very importantly, salaried labor in the formal sector pays a tax for the Social Security contributions of the contributory Social Security contributions, so that that's the tax that they pay. But informal labor, as I will show you in a minute, because they receive social insurance benefits that they don't pay for, it's a subsidy to informal employment, so that the structure of incentives in this economy is given by this structure of taxes. But I want to emphasize the fact that I want to see all taxes in the same general group setting at the same time. Firms face probabilities lambda of being fined if they evade the income taxes or the value-added taxes. Those probabilities are a function of the size of the firm. They're increasing in the capital stock of the firm, so that smaller firms will evade more, and as the capital stock increases, the probability of the firm being caught cheated increases. And then firms face, this is what the SAT does for my Mexican friends. There's a reason we said something with that, right? So they observe firms on the basis of the size of the firm. This is what the IMSS does. The IMSS also punishes firms if they evade Social Security contributions, but they do also on the number of legal workers that they hire. And these probabilities are increasing in both the arguments of the number of legal workers. So for a firm to hire legal workers is very tempting because you evade all the Social Security contributions, but there's always a risk that you're going to be caught. And if you're caught, you have to pay penalties, which are greater than the taxes that you would have paid otherwise. So this is the evasion and the effective tax rates paid on the VAT. With probability 1 minus lambda, the firm is not caught and doesn't pay anything. With probability lambda, it is caught, and then it pays the value-added tax that it would have paid plus a penalty, so that the compliance rate for a firm is going to be the less of what it would have paid over what it must have paid legally. And that compliance rate is a number between 0 and 1, and the compliance rate is a very important element here because it says firms that are small comply less, firms that are larger comply more. And there's a 1 for each firm, there's a compliance rate. That's the firm level compliance rate. And then the sector compliance rate is simply the distribution given the capital stock of the firms by how the capital stock is distributed in sector 1 and sector 2. And the aggregate compliance rate of the economy is the weighted average of the compliance rate in the non-zero sector and the sector with a 50% rate. And this tells me this is an economy in which there's a lot of evasion of VAT going on, and this evasion of VAT is going on related to the size of distribution of firms. Next, please. So what is social insurance? And how is it done here? Contributory social insurance is expressed as a percentage of the wage, and in Mexico it includes health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, workers' insurance, all this other stuff here. Also some labor taxes and severance payment, and you make the monetary equivalent to the severance payment, the expected value of that is what's included into the percentage of that. And in Mexico, as in some countries in Europe, social insurance, contributory social insurance is partly paid by the government. That's a proportion Y minus theta paid by firms and workers, and this is the proportion paid by the government. And then non-contributory social insurance is a whole bunch of social insurance programs that are out there. Some have been there out there for 2 decades, 3 decades, although in the last decade they've been growing in importance. And workers in the informal sector can get some kind of health insurance, some kind of retirement pensions, programs for non-contributory retirement pensions, or daycare centers, or social housing services. And these non-contributory social insurance is expressed as a per capita moment, and the government pays 100% of it. Next, please. So what happens in the labor market? In the labor market, workers value the contributory social security contributions at some proportion of that. There's a lot of big literature that says that that number is less than 1. Workers value the bundle of goods that is given through non-contributory social insurance at that. These two belong to 0 and 1. So the utility of formal employment is the wage plus the value to the worker of social insurance benefits, contributory social insurance benefits. The utility of informal employment is the wage plus the non-contributory social insurance benefits. And then workers arbitrage in the labor market. They arbitrage such that the utilities between formal and informal sector are equalized in the labor market. That implies that there's an implicit tax on formal employment, which is given by this amount. That's the tax that firms are evading on the social security side. And there's an implicit subsidy to hiring workers illegally through the non-contributory social insurance programs. And very importantly for the economics of this, the average cost of a formal worker is this, what the firm pays. The average cost of an informal worker is this. The marginal will equalize when firms optimize. But for the self-employment sector, since there's no penalty for hiring workers without contributory social insurance, those are the average costs. Next, please. So this is what firms do. In the intermediate sector, firms producing the two intermediate goods, they're going to maximize profits, giving the effective value-added tax that they think applies to them because they're evading, so that the actual VAT rate depends on the size of the firm. They're going to choose optimally legal and illegal workers to maximize profits, and that will solve me for the demand for formal labor, the demand for informal labor, and the amount of production of intermediates. In the final goods sector, firms are going to choose combinations of the two final goods to maximize profits, and in the non-salaried sector, very simple, self-employed workers simply maximize profits, and they choose. So there's demand for legal labor, demand for illegal labor in both sectors of the economy, and demand for self-employment, and that fixes behavior in the labor market. Next, please. VAT rate is very important in this model. So the VAT is administered via the credit method. This is the way it works in Mexico. Firms pay VAT at each stage of the intermediate inputs, and the firm that pays VAT on the purchase input gets credit when it pays the VAT on the next stage in the production. So total VAT collections are the sum from the smallest firm to the largest firm, given the distribution of the capital stock, of all the VAT revenues paid, given the evasion of each firm in the intermediate goods. In the final goods is given how much VAT was paid in the final goods, less the VAT in the intermediate, and total revenues of the VAT. And a very important point for what follows, look how social insurance determines firms' choices between hiring workers legally and illegally, and depending on whether firms are complying or not complying, they're paying VAT or they're not paying VAT. So as you change these two taus, the subsidy to informal labor or the tax on formal labor, the incentives of firms to comply or not comply with the VAT are going to be changed at the margin, and evasion is going to be endogenous to the social insurance structure. Next week. Finally, Michael, you were mentioning at the beginning of the talk that attention has shifted from the product market to the labor market. So I go to the extreme in which I simply make the small open economy assumption, right? I normalize prices, so this is a very Walrasian model in that sense. And consumer prices are going, for some reason this should have a tilde, but the Microsoft didn't put it. These are the consumer prices, this has a tilde, which is the producer price, and how much of the VAT is passed on to the consumer depends on compliance. So if the compliance is 100%, all of it is paid. If the compliance is less, less is paid. So that gives me the CPI and then real wages. Next week. These are the resource endowments of the economy. The capital stock is distributed in the intermediate with 1 and 2. The sum of the capital stock is the whole capital stock of the economy. This is the demand for legal labor in sector 1, legal labor in sector 2, so that's formal employment. Illegal labor in sector 1, illegal labor in sector 2, plus the self-employment sector, that gives me informal employment, and that's the two resource constraints. Next. And then very importantly, the government's budget constraint. So the government collects revenues from other sources that I will look at, oil, rent, and whatever you want. VAT, which is endogenous to the incentive structure. Income taxes, endogenous to the incentive structure. The government spends money subsidizing contributory social insurance, because some part of social insurance is paid by the government, and the government pays money for all the non-contributory social insurance programs. And then, if you go through the comparative statistics of this, what is important is to realize that depending on how you change the VAT rates, the revenues are going to change, and very importantly, the sign of these derivatives, as you increase the taxes or the subsidies, the taxes on formality or the subsidies on informality, revenues of the VAT are going to go down. But if you increase the subsidies to formality, revenues from the VAT are going to go up. Why? Because the incentives to be able to come down. So I close the model here to talk about numbers now, some results. It's a very simple structure at the end of the day. It's a simple structure in which producer prices are given, they're factor endowments, the distribution of capital stock in the two sectors. Firms have tax rates, enforcement probabilities, and penalties. And the government sets social insurance benefits for contributory social insurance and for non-contributory social insurance. And they determine endogenously wages, utilities, the distribution of the labor force, non-child employment, output levels, and very importantly, the budget constraint of the government. Next, please. Okay, so what do we do with that? Next, please. So this is about a year and a half worth of work in one slide. Okay, we very painfully matched the IMSS data with the employment, with the survey, with the census data, at firm size by firm size, grouping all firms into the food and exempt sector and firms into the other no sector. Got the capital stock, the employment, legal, illegal for each firm, and we reproduce the distribution of the capital stock, we reproduce the distribution of the labor between the two sectors and self-employment. And then, with Arturo and Fausto, we also did a lot of work. We get the public accounts, and we get the total revenues that were collected from VAT in Mexico in 2008, the income taxes, the social security revenues, all the money that went to the IMSS, that went to the Afores, that went to Infonavit, everything that went to the social insurance accounts. We use all the official parameters. I make a quick footnote, except for the income tax, because the income tax is such a complicated tax because of all the exemptions, that our treatment of the income tax here is not good. Our treatment of the value add, I think, is pretty good, but the income tax here is very Mickey Mouse. In fact, more work needs to be done on the structure of the income tax. And then, since we don't observe the evasion rates by firms, we spent a lot of time asking ourselves the following question. I observe the collected revenues. I observe the tax base. I observe the tax rate. What must have been the evasion rate that, given the tax rate and the tax base, gives me the tax revenues that I observe? So we reproduce the evasion test, and then we do some consistency test on the model, homogeneous of degree 1 in prices, homogeneous of degree 0 for the real variables, double accounting for GDP, so it squares. I got our results. Okay. This is how the model performs. This is GDP in thousands of millions of pesos of 2008. This was the exogenous, which I'm not going to fiddle with, government spending. This was the amount of money spent on subsidies to contributory social insurance, about 0.5% of GDP, about 1.25% of GDP in subsidies to non-contributory social insurance. Very importantly, guys, notice that subsidies to non-contributory social insurance are twice, more than 2.5 times, subsidies to contributory social insurance. These are the amount of VAT revenues, income taxes, and this is the fiscal balance observed in this year. Now compare that to what we calibrate. So it's pretty good. It looks pretty good. Okay? So we reproduce the budget constraint of the government. Exactly. Next. We reproduce the social insurance accounts. So this is, in 2008, the observed amount of money that went into the health services of contributory social insurance, disability insurance, workers' insurance, daycare, in thousands of millions of pesos. This is the money that went into the retirement accounts of firms and worker contributions. This is what the government put in, and these are the calibrated amounts. And if you compare how much we're calibrating, we reproduce all the accounts for the IMSS, the Infonavit, the Afores, the state taxes, and we also reproduce the non-contributory social insurance how much was spent in health programs, in pension programs, in housing programs, and in daycare programs on the non-contributory social insurance part. Next, please. This is the composition of employment. This is measured in millions of workers. 5.3 million workers in Sector 1. We calibrate 5.24. 14.8 million workers. 14.86, 18.9, 18.9. The total labor force below the 43 million that I showed you before, because I excluded public sector workers. This is the distribution of formal and informal labor force in our model, salaried and non-salaried. So we reproduce the labor force by sector, by self-employment, by formal and informal, and by firm size. So this is in Sector 1, how many workers in firms from 2 to 5 workers. This is how much we calibrate. How many workers in Sector 2 to 5. This is how much we calibrate. Sector 1, Sector 2. So the model passes through the whole distribution of the labor force by firm sector, by legal and illegal, by firm size, by formal and informal, and self-employment. Next, please. And the last part that we do in calibration is we actually test how much additional VAT revenue the model gets and compare that to exogenous estimates. So, under current enforcement, this is how much the government is collecting. This is what our model predicts. Assuming full compliance, these are the studies that I told you before of people that have worked the tax revenues from the national accounts. They say, look, with this structure of rates, you would be collecting 6.08%. Our model predicts that it collects 6.12%. And then, if you went to a 15% homogeneous VAT across everything, people that have done these studies with full compliance say the country should be collecting about 10% of GDP in VAT. Our model says we would be collecting about 10.6% in GDP. So, on the comparative statics on the evasion, we also calibrate the model so that comparative statics of the evasion reproduce the same evasion rate. Next, please. All right. 3 preliminary questions, and then we go for the main point. In what follows, I'm going to assume that the government's enforcement efforts don't change. The probabilities that firms are caught by the government and are put penalties by the government are always the same. The only thing that is changing here are the incentives of firms to evade or not to evade, given the incentive structure that they're facing. And as I said before, we don't have a good treatment to be compensated. Okay, so the first question is, who pays for contributory social insurance? So first we say, if there was no social insurance whatsoever, neither contributory nor non-contributory social insurance, what would we get? And the answer is, that would be the wage. We normalize that to be 1. There would be no reason to be illegal salaried employment. There would be self-employment. No subsidies to the government. And this is the amount of VAT revenues that will be collected in the original period. Suppose that now you create contributory social insurance. The first thing to notice is that contributory social insurance actually lowers the real wage. And that we all know. Most contributions are paid by workers. It lowers the real wage, so the incidence of that is passed on to the work. Utility goes down a little bit. But note what happens as soon as you begin putting a tax on formal labor. The incentives to evade are important, and now a large chunk of the labor force becomes informal, but also a large chunk of the labor force goes into the self-employment sector. So a very important point here, the size of the self-employment sector is endogenous to the incentive structure of the whole economy, and the red and the green that I showed you earlier is so big because there is a tax on the blue. And this tells you that that tax on the blue matters. Now, the government subsidizes Social Security. This is the rates at which it's subsidized at present. That increases the real wage because firms' demand for labor increase now that the labor is being subsidized. It picks up on formal employment a little bit. Self-employment goes down a little bit. You still don't restore the real wage because the tax is still there. And then finally, the status quo, which is what we have today. We have contributory social insurance, a subsidy to contributory social insurance, and a subsidy to non-contributory social insurance equivalent to about 5,650 pesos per worker in 2008. And that, what it will do is, it will lower formal employment, it will increase informal employment. And now, what happened to the VAT revenues? From here to here, VAT revenues came down. And the reason they come down is because when you put taxes on the formal sector through labor, firms' incentives to evade get bigger, and VAT revenues come down, and the income taxes come down. Now you spend money on subsidizing Social Security. Firms have slightly more incentives to pay VAT, but still, because you're paying a lot this for Social Security, you begin to lose money, and when you now spend money on contributing social insurance, the net fiscal impact is quite negative. Next, please. So, first point, these taxes are very distortionary. Second, contributory social insurance are mostly paid by workers. A very important message in Mexico. People think that contributory social insurance is paid by firms. People think that contributory social insurance is a way to redistribute income. It is not. It is providing social insurance. And then the sizes of the taxable sector and the non-taxable sector are being endogenous. And just a quick question for people who do a lot of incident analysis. When we do incident analysis, we never ask the question of what happens, who's paying for the subsidies to social insurance, and very importantly, who's paying for the foregone revenues that social insurance is causing, because the value add is being eroded importantly. So first question, contributions are paid by workers. Next. The second question is interesting. It says, what are the fiscal costs of subsidies to contributory social insurance and non-contributory social insurance? So suppose you're here, and suppose you decide, I want to increase social spending. And do two exogenous different experiments. Increase by exactly 15,000 million pesos, arbitrarily, spending in social insurance. I can spend in social insurance through the formal sector, or I can spend in social insurance through the informal sector. When I spend through the formal sector, I promote formality so that income taxes and value-added taxes go up. And once I take into account the additional spending, but the fact that if I promote formality, I generate more VAT and more income taxes, this is a really interesting result. Each peso of subsidies to contributory social insurance costs 76 cents. But what happens to the same amount of spending in non-contributory social insurance? What that will do is that will increase the incentives to evade. It will cost me 15,000 pesos more here, but VAT revenues are going to go down, the income taxes are going to go down, and I work through all that. The cost of that peso of subsidies is going to be 1 peso and 4 cents, because in the meantime, I'm promoting evasion on the other side of the coin. So that's the second question. It is not the same to increase social insurance spending, subsidizing formality and informality strictly from the fiscal point of view. The third question next is, what if I think of the trade-offs for VAT and social security contributions? So this is an index of the real wage. Given firms' compliance, the government enforcement efforts are the same. If I now tax food and medicines at 16% rate, what that would do is that would lower the real wage. Given the compliance of firms, because some of the VAT is being evaded, that would lower the real wage by about 4%. Okay, so now look at these curves on the same real wage, but now think of this. And I already showed you before that the TAO, the contributory social insurance, was a tax on real wages. So you're here for a VAT curve at 0 rate. Suppose that now you put a VAT of 16%. What that would do is that would reduce, we saw already, the real wage. But then I ask myself the question, can I lower the contributions to social insurance to restore the same real wage for the higher VAT? So I'm playing between the VAT rate and the tax rate on the contributory social insurance, and I realize that there's a trade-off between them, and I exactly find that I can reduce that from 0.38 to 0.3 and produce exactly the same real wage. So from the point of view of the real wage, the combination of 0 rate on this and 0.38 is exactly the same combination as 0.16 on that and 0.3 on that, from the point of view of the real wage. As I'll show you in a minute, it's not the same from the point of view of total revenues and from the point of view of productivity in the general economy. So the way I like to think about this is, at the end of the day, are you taxing people at the door of the factory? Or are you taxing people at the door of the store? And all I'm saying is that a lot more people walk through the door of the stores than the people who walk through the door of the factories. Not that you cannot evade the door of the store. There is evasion going on. But a lot more people walk through the door of the factory than through the door of the store than through the door of the factory. Next group. Okay, so, and let me go to the results. Next. So, the 3 questions basically say, look, what are you doing at the end of the day today? What is the status quo in Mexico today? You have a tax on real wage in the formal sector. You're using the proceeds of that tax in the real wage in the formal sector for contributory social insurance. You leave out some guys. That's not good from the social point of view. You put in non-contributory social insurance, but you're subsidizing informal labor. But that is eroding your tax base. And in the meantime, you're inducing a lot of evasion and a lot of informality. Note that today, Mexico already uses VAT revenues for social insurance. Because already today, we're using VAT revenues to pay for the subsidies to contributory social insurance and for the subsidies to non-contributory social insurance. Except that contributory social insurance also has a tax on labor. It's a very mixed way, when you think about it from the public finance point of view, it's a very, mixed way of financing social security. So what am I going to do with universal social insurance? Next, please. I'm going to give all workers the same benefits that currently formal workers receive. So I'm costing the same IMSS health package for the universe of 39 million workers. I provide all workers with a retirement pension equal to the one that worker who gets 2 minimum wages. But note, and I didn't speak here about transit with informality and informality, because everybody is getting that contribution, the contribution rates, the density rates are going to be 100%. Today, in the pension system, people only put in when they're formal, which is about 45% of their time. And I'm going to provide everybody with life and disability insurance. And I'm going to subsidize 100% of these benefits from general revenues. So how does that compare? The subsidy to contributory social insurance today is about 5,000 pesos per worker. The subsidy to non-contributory social insurance is about $5,600, 600 pesos per worker. The universal social insurance, I'm changing notation now. The universal social insurance would be about 14,000 pesos per worker annually. Right, this is the main result of the paper. This is the main result of the paper. This says, today you're collecting this much in VAT, you have 3.76% in revenues, these are the amounts, and you have a fiscal deficit of 1.56%. Index that as the real wages, and that's the composition of employment. You have all these informal employment, you have this formal employment, and that's the distribution between the food and the non-food sector. That's it. It's too bad you can't see the headings, but this column here says, why don't you make the VAT 16 everything, but leave the current structure of contributory and non-contributory social insurance. As expected, you generate more revenues. Informality increases a little bit. And it increases a little bit because when VAT goes up, firms have more incentive to evade. And when they evade both the VAT and they evade a little bit on the contributory part. So you're going to have a little bit more informality if you just do a tax reform. But you're going to improve, importantly, the fiscal balance of the government because you're basically collecting 3 more points of GDP, which in this column I'm not spending. All right. So the piece de resistance is, what if you spend that, forget about contributory social insurance, forget about non-contributory social insurance, and provide everybody with universal social insurance. Well, if you do that, you don't spend in that anymore, you don't spend in that anymore, you spend a lot in the universal social insurance for 40 million workers, but you can do it. Because you're collecting more VAT and you're collecting more income taxes. So the result is that Mexico can transit from the status quo to universal social insurance with a 16% homogeneous VAT rate without affecting the fiscal balance. And because the economy is more efficient, because the tax on formal labor has disappeared, the real wage is going to go up and utility is going to go up. Notice the drastic composition in the change of the sectors. Next, please. Okay? There's some, I don't want to spend time on this. You can quibble with the numbers, and you can put the benefits slightly higher, you can put the benefits slightly smaller, you can change them a little bit more or less, but the basic point is you're within 0.5% of a point of doing one thing or the other, and you can, we can work on the numbers and be more precise, but basically, you're basically home. Why? This is perhaps the most important slide from the economic point of view. Why? Because the incentive structure to firms and workers today is pretty perverse. The non-tax sector is getting a subsidy to informal employment through non-contributory social insurance, which is actually growing. These guys are paying that tax, and that's the aggregate VAT rate, and these are the structural rates. Look at this. So it's beautiful. It is truly beautiful, right? You correct the relative price of the non-food versus the food sector, which is a major distortion today. You correct the relative price of hiring legally versus hiring illegally, and the incentives to evade are more than offset. Even the food sector, very interestingly, expands. And the reason it expands is even though it's now paying VAT, so they would have more incentives to evade, because it doesn't pay labor taxes, you bring that, the labor taxes, the net is that the food sector expands. So the end of informality, in the Rabi Campbell says, yes. All workers are covered by the same social insurance, regardless of labor status. Self-employed, salaried, whatever you want. Not the end of illegality. Firms are evading, they continue to evade income taxes, but they're evading less than before. I didn't do anything on enforcement. And the self-employment still pays no tax, so I'm still continuing to assume that the red and the blue still pay no tax, but the red and the blue are going to get a lot smaller than what they were before. Sorry, the red and the green are going to get a lot smaller, and the blue is going to. So this equilibrium is much better than the current equilibrium. It's not perfect. There's still evasion, there's still illegality, there's still self-employment, there's still people out there in the streets of Mexico City washing your windshield, but there are a third of them, but everybody's protected by social insurance. The same social insurance. Next please. You can think of variants of social insurance. This is the clean one. Universal Social Insurance point 1. You can think of providing salaried workers with work risk and unemployment insurance, which you only provide them when they're salaried. So that would introduce a small little tax on salaried labor. And you can think of this, the cost of salary to firms would increase a little bit, so I don't like this tau star, but maybe you have to, if the beta on that is not too high, it's not too distortionary, so you can have unemployment insurance and work risk insurance. And then, if you want, and you want people to save more for the pensions, you want to do consumption smoothing, you can put a slightly higher here and do some consumption smoothing by another variant of universal social security. This is the clean, this is the one that I like, because the one that I like has also protection against output shocks and risk shocks. And the tax that I calculate you need to fund that is very, very small. So the incentive to legality that you produce associated with that is very small. Next please. So I'll close here. Government spending in social insurance increases by 150%. So it's a major architectural redesign of the social insurance system in Mexico. Social spending for currently informal workers can increase without increasing distortions that lower productivity, which has been happening in Mexico over the last 2 decades. Pensions, everybody gets a pension with contribution rates of 100%. The annual flow of resources to the pension system increases by 1.3 of, so this is good for national savings, because everybody's saving 100% of the time for the pension. And this will expand the market for annuities, for retirement, for disability, and for survivorship pensions, because instead of having 14 million people in the market, you're going to have 40 million people in the market for these pensions. Next, please. Health is excellent, because everybody's going to get the IMSS health package, which is better than the other package. Public spending in health increases from about this % of GDP, so it's basically 1 more point of GDP to be spent on public health. And a very important point that my friends at the IMSS will realize is that the self-selection problem that the IMSS currently faces, in which people, when they get bad disease, they go to the IMSS, and when they're healthy, they go out of the IMSS, that sorting problem, because of the incomplete risk pooling, disappears because you're going to pool all the risks. Very importantly, you can now replace the severance pay with unemployment insurance, because everybody would have an account, and you can do kind of a children's-style unemployment insurance. I don't have time to speak about this. I spoke a lot about this in my book on good intentions, bad outcomes. But the key point here is that currently, subsidies to non-contributory social insurance are higher for the poor than the non-poor. That's the good intentions. The bad outcomes part is the subsidy to informality for the poor is higher than for the non-poor. So you would correct that problem. Next. So another work that I've been doing with other friends at the IDB, what we find is that the productivity of capital and labor in the formal sector is higher than the productivity of capital and labor in the informal sector. So you would have a TFP gain, which we conservatively estimate in about 35%. And then, from the fiscal point of view, we think the administration of the VAT would be much simpler, because you have a homogeneous rate, so a lot of the cheaper would go. And then, my proposal is to divide the VAT rate into a contribution that I would label it contribution for universal social insurance, which would be the 10%, earmarked for social insurance for everybody, and then the rest for whatever. And we have to do some work to study the cyclical properties of this model, and to see how countercyclical fiscal policy would do, but you would have some inbuilt stabilizers, because basically you have a European-style social insurance system by now, right? Next, please. This is a big plus from the political point of view. All Mexican workers would have the same legal rights, the same social rights. This is very good for social inclusion. And society could choose a different package than the one I chose, and then they would have to fix a different rate. And society would have a very clear, clean choice as to exactly how much they want to pay and how much they want to get. And finally, I think this will lower inequality. I've done a little bit of numbers, and this lowers the Gini by about 0.03. So I end. Next. Next. This is my last thought. I think the real key here is to understand that what was thought about more than 100 years ago, that conceptual architecture is no longer serving Mexico, and I would argue no longer serving Latin America. That conceptual architecture is flawed. Contributory social insurance, 6 decades after it was created, has only covered 1/3 of the Mexican labor force. I repeat, 6 decades after it was put in place, contributory social insurance covers only 1/3 of the labor force. It has not worked. The government is now being pushed into the direction of non-contributory social insurance because it has to. And it is aggravating the distortions, aggravating the erosion of the tax rate and the value-added rate, and it's lowering productivity. So these ideas need to give, need to move on. And basically the punchline when I close here is, I think in Mexico we can move on. Thank you.
making use of the privilege of being here and asking Santiago the first question, which is, I didn't see in the presentation what would be the effect of a higher value or general value-added tax to labor supply. And the reason why I ask this is because, I mean, in the presentation, the tax of Social Security was presented as a homogeneous tax rate, which indeed is not. So at middle salary levels in Mexico, the marginal tax rate is actually 0, and yet the value of the tax is 16% uniform. So I wonder whether, I think the idea is right, and it's just whether the numbers will actually fit, or you will have to fiddle them a bit more. I think, I do believe the value of the tax in terms of the labor market is as distortionary as the income tax. And so I mean, what's the deadweight loss, so to speak, so to say it, with this structure percent. The other question is let me do that. I don't know if you want to collect some questions, and you reply to everything. Are there any questions to be raised from the floor? Yes.
I wonder whether you expect at the individual level who are the winners, who are the losers in your report? Because even though there is an increase in efficiency in the performance,
Santiago is always estimating. What's about the transition? It's easy to see on the other side that these solutions, most of the things we assume. The other side what has to do with the acquired rights and the current pension system. How you would translate them now?
Okay, so let me then pass the microphone to Santiago.
Thank you all three for very good questions, and all very difficult questions actually, which all require work. On Alejandro's question, so here the labor supply is being exhausted, and more work needs to be done on exactly what happens to labor supply. And it can cut both ways. You can cut on the way that you mentioned, because in the VAT, the upper tail of the distribution, it might actually be a worker's incentive. But on the other hand, because the real wage is going up, you might also have a positive. The labor leisure choice of workers is also going to change in the direction of more labor, because the cost of leisure is going to go up. The cost of leisure is going to go up and so on. So we need to do a little bit more work on the labor supply, and that's connected to your question. We need to do a little bit more work with the distribution of the labor force. But on one of the variants of universal social insurance, you can really think that there are no losers in the following sense. The workers in the formal sector, clearly workers in the informal sector are all net gainers by a long shot. The subsidy that they're receiving goes up from about 5,600 pesos to about 15,000 pesos a year. So all workers in the informal sector are clearly much better off. Formal sector workers are going to have the same health package that they had before. They're now going to get part of the pension paid from the general revenues. So if you want to have the same pension as they had before, the difference between what they now get from the government as a universal pension and the additional part of the two-pillar will have to be paid. That was my variant 3 with the tax on labor, and then there are no losers because you provide them with the same social insurance package that they had before. The question of Alejandro becomes relevant. They're going to be paying a VAT rate of 16%. But the economy is also going to be more efficient and the real wage is going to go up. So then the next area of work is to look at the size distribution of the labor force and check at the upper tail of distribution exactly what is going on. Although the thing here is bounded about minimum wages, so that doesn't worry me much. And the compensation would be actually fairly small, not too costly. So I think it can be done. On Robert's question, so the transition I think is key, right? The transition is key. In my view, it is less important how fast you transit than to make sure that you clear where you transit to. I won't believe in cold turkey reform. don't believe, I think this could be done step by step. What is really important is to have a view of where you want to end up, and to make it intertemporally consistent. My argument with today is that today is intertemporally inconsistent. We're on the path of fiscal insustainability. Because you're on the path of continually subsidizing the taxpayers. So what you do here, I think this could be done in 5 years. Increase the VAT rate in proportion over 4 years. You have to do a lot of work on the health side to increase the infrastructure because you're going to stimulate the demand. You can do this in 5 years. Or perhaps, as Dr. Simon was saying at the beginning, in Germany they took quite a few years to do reform. Suppose you take 10. It will be better in 2020 than today. The problem today is that we're, again, never really consistent. And from the productivity point of view and from the fiscal point of view. So it worries me less if I do this in 5 years or 7 years or 8 years than if we continue to see this through.
Okay, well, thank you very much.